I would like to show you one of the greatest games played by Aron Nimzowitsch. The game had a shocking effect on the chess world. The world champion Emanuel Lasker considered it the best game played in 10 years, while the Danish grandmaster Bent Larsen said that this game, more than any other, influenced his development as a player. The game is notable for the astonishing queen maneuver, which completely paralyzed the opponent's position. In accordance with his famous concept of first restrain, then blockade, and finally destroy, Nimzowitsch finishes the game with a brilliant attack. Nimzowicz's opponent starts with d4 and Nimzowitsch plays his own defense, the Nimzo-Indian defense. After knight f6, c4, e6 and knight c3, black starts fighting for the center, bishop b4, by pinning the knight which controls the central squares. White opts for the Rubinstein variation, e3, opening the light-squared bishop's diagonal in order to develop it to d3, take under control the e4 square and push the e-pawn forward, getting the complete domination in the center. Nimzowitsch castles kingside, and after bishop d3, white is ready to play e4. That's why Nimzowitsch immediately attacks white's center by playing c5 and prevents the e4 advance. Of course, in this case, the d4 pawn would be unguarded and black would simply capture it. White develops the king knight, Nimzowitsch develops the queen's knight, and white castles, unpinning his knight. Nimzowitsch exchanges his bishop for the knight, after which white gets the advantage of two bishops, but his pawn structure on the queen side is damaged. He gets the doubled pawns on the c-file and an isolated pawn on a2. And the c4 pawn usually becomes white's main weakness in the Nimzo-Indian defense. So this pawn will turn into a target of attack. Black can play knight a5, attacking it for the first time, followed by bishop a6, attacking the pawn for the second time, and if necessary, the major pieces can join the attack too. After c takes d, black opens the c-file, and the defense of this pawn would become problematic. Nimzowitsch plays d6, taking under control the e5 square, preparing the advance of his e-pawn. And white plays knight d2, which has two ideas. The first one is to unblock the f-pawn and move it forward, and the second one is to meet possible knight a5 with knight b3. For example, in case black plays e5, after d5 and knight a5, white can play knight b3, and that would lead to the exchange of black's strong knight, which attacks the main weakness. That's why after knight d2, Nimzowitsch plays b6, vacating the b7 square for his knight. Now, after e5, d5, knight a5 and knight b3, white offers the exchange of the knights, but the black knight from a5 can retreat to b7, avoiding the exchange. And in this position, Nimzowitsch recommends for white immediate f4. In this case, after e5 and the exchange on e5, white can move his central pawn, getting the protected passed pawn, but after knight a5, knight b3, knight b7, e4 and knight e8, the position would be more or less equal. Of course, white has the protected passed pawn, the half-open f-file, and the possibility of creating active play on the queen side. Black in his turn has a great blockading square for the knight. The knight will control the very important squares, and which is the most important, will exert pressure on white's weakness on c4. And after moving away the knight from b7, black can play bishop a6, exerting more pressure on white's c4 pawn. But instead of f4, white in this position played knight b3, taking under control the a5 square and preventing the black knight from jumping there. However, knight b3 was an inaccuracy, because on d2 the knight controlled the e4 square, and now that it moved away, black immediately exploits that by playing e5. It turns out that in case white plays d5, black isn't forced to move the knight. Instead, he has a stronger move, e4, attacking the white bishop in his turn and vacating the e5 square for his knight. In case white moves the bishop, the knight will be greatly placed in the center of the board. Or, if white captures the knight, black of course captures the bishop, after which white doesn't have the advantage of two bishops anymore. Of course, both of these pawns will fall, and as a result, white's doubled pawns on the c-file will become even weaker, as they will become isolated, so that this position would be in black's favor. That's why after e5, instead of moving the central pawn, white plays f4. But now Nimzowitsch crosses the center of the board with a tempo, and his pawn is very strong on e4, exerting pressure on white's position. And the bishop retreats to e2. And we have reached the critical moment of the game. In this position, Nimzowitsch makes a move, and not just a move, the whole idea was revolutionary and it shocked the chess world. And you can pause the video and try to find it. I will just give you a small tip. What is white's main active plan, what white wants to do next move, and how to stop it, how to prevent it. So, as Nimzowitsch writes in his annotations, white has the qualitative pawn majority on the king side. As you see, the pawn, the f-pawn, has already moved forward, and white can move the g-pawn, followed by the further advance of the pawns, and the pawn storm on the king side might be very dangerous. So, black must try to prevent this. Nimzowitsch writes in his annotations that he considered two possible ways of doing that. The first one was the simple way, namely knight e8, unblocking the f-pawn, and in case white plays g4, he can blockade the f-pawn by playing f5. Now the f-pawn cannot move forward, but in this variation, white could have first blockaded the center and then the king side. And the position would be completely blockaded, and most probably the game would have ended in a draw. But Nimzowitsch felt that he already had some advantage, so he preferred to play for a win. So instead of the simple way, knight e8, he made his phenomenal move, queen d7, which at first sight doesn't make any sense because the queen stands right in front of the bishop, closing its diagonal. However, queen d7 is the first move of the great queen maneuver. The idea is to take under control the g4 square. The queen, together with the bishop and the knight, controls the g4 square, while white controls this square only twice and prevents white from playing g4. So now Bent Larsen in his annotations recommends to activate the bishop, because this bishop is white's main problem. It's a bad bishop as it's restricted by its own pawns on the dark squares, so Larsen recommends to play bishop d2 followed by bishop e1 and bishop h4, which might lead to the exchange of the bad bishop for the knight. But instead of this, in our game, white insisted upon his plan of the pawn storm on the king side and played h3, which at first sight looks absolutely sensible, which makes perfect sense. So black has placed his queen in front of the bishop, which looks unnatural, to prevent g4, so white plays h3 and will play g4 anyways, after which the queen will look absolutely ridiculous in front of the bishop. However, h3 move was a mistake. It had a drawback, namely it weakened the g3 square, and Nimzowitsch immediately exploits that. Knight e7. The knight is heading to g3, which will lead to the exchange of the knight for the bishop, and the light-squared bishop plays a very important role. It is the main defender of white's main weakness on c4. So after the exchange of the knight for the bishop, black will attack the pawn, and it isn't clear how white will defend it. So white must do something against the threat of the exchange of the knight for the bishop. But what can white do? In case white plays in the most straightforward way, namely g4, in accordance with his initial plan and taking under control the f5 square, preventing the knight from jumping on f5, Nimzowitsch prepared h5. Attacking the g4 pawn for the fourth time, and it isn't clear how white can defend it. Actually, white cannot defend it. If the pawn moves forward, the h3 pawn would fall. In this case, black can even sacrifice the knight and start a devastating attack after queen takes h3, g takes f, queen g3 check, king h1, the knight invades f5, threatening knight h4, after which it isn't clear how white is going to defend against the checkmate on g2, so white can capture on h5, not to win a pawn of course, but to open way for his queen, so the bishop moves away from the second rank and the queen can defend the g2 square. However, queen h3 check is possible, and after king g1, knight g3, the knight is attacking the bishop together with the queen, so the bishop is under attack, the rook is under attack, queen h1 check is very unpleasant, so white can save the bishop, but in this case queen h1 check is possible, king f2, queen h4 with a deadly threat of the discovered check. The knight is threatening to jump with a check, and the queen, the knight, the bishop, if necessary, the rook after king h8 and g takes f from g8 might join the attack. So all black pieces take part in the attack and it will be deadly. For example, if the king tries to run away via e1, simply knight takes f1 check, and that leads to checkmate in a few moves in this case. So after knight e7, g4, the most straightforward way, doesn't work. What else can white do to prevent the invasion of the e7 knight to g3? He can also try king h2, taking under control the g3 square, vacating the g1 square for the rook, so that the rook supports the advance of the g-pawn. But in this case, g6 is possible, preparing h5. In this case, after g4 and h5, of course, the white pawn can neither capture nor move to g5. In this case, the h3 pawn would fall. So white can defend his pawn by playing rook g1, but in this case, a strong move, king g7 would follow. Black is preparing rook h8, and it isn't clear how white is going to defend against the threat of h takes g. So the white king is in trouble on the h file. That's why after knight e7, white played queen e1, taking under control the g3 square. However, this move had a serious drawback. The queen from d1, together with the bishop, controlled the h5 square, preventing black from playing h5. But now that the queen has moved away from d1, only the bishop controls the h5 square. So, as black also controls its square once with the knight, h5 is possible. So now white's king side is restrained. Now white cannot play g4 anymore, because the pawn, together with the knight, the queen and the bishop, controls the g4 square. So on the king side, white is restrained. What can white do? In case white plays queen h4, attacking the h5 pawn for the second time, black can play knight f5, attacking the queen, and after queen g5, knight h7, the queen is under attack, and after queen takes h5, the weakness of the g3 square will tell. The knight invades with a fork and black is winning the exchange. That's why after h5, white played bishop d2. Nimzowitsch continues his great queen maneuver. It isn't over yet. Queen f5. He will improve the position of the queen. The queen moves away from the diagonal of the bishop, and after king h2, which looks sensible, the king controls the g3 square, vacating the g1 square for the rook. And now Nimzowitsch finishes his magnificent queen maneuver by playing queen h7, which at first sight again looks quite strange. The queen looks very passively placed on h7, but it isn't the case. Actually, the queen is greatly placed, preventing g4 even more. Now there is no way white can play g4, because in this case black will capture and the h-pawn will be pinned, so white won't be able to recapture. Besides that, the queen supports the h-pawn, and the h-pawn might move forward to h4, completely paralyzing white's king side. After this, the g-pawn cannot move, because neither to g3 nor to g4, because the pawn from h4 will simply capture it and the h-file will open in this case. So, as his play on the king side is completely restrained, white tries to create some active play on the queen side now. a4 follows. He is threatening to play a5, open the a-file, create weakness on b6, and of course after immediate a5 and capture on b6, black cannot even recapture, as his rook on a8 would fall, but Nimzowitsch plays knight f5. He creates his own threat. It turns out that in case white continues his active play on the queen side by playing a5, Nimzowitsch prepared knight g4 check. And after h takes g check. Now we can see the power of the queen on the h-file. The king must retreat to g1, and g3, there is no way white can escape the checkmate on h2 except giving up his queen on g3. That's why after knight f5, white plays g3. Now, of course, knight g4 check doesn't work, because after h takes g, and king g1, black cannot move his g-pawn forward anymore, as the g3 pawn blockades it. Besides that, by playing g3, white also prevented black from playing h4. In this case, the pawn can move forward to g4 and it will be supported by the h3 pawn. So, after g3, white threatens to play a5, creating the active play on the queen side. So, after finishing the restrained phase of the game, so white's play on the king side is completely restrained. Now it's time for the second phase, the blockade. So Nimzowitsch first blockades the queen side, a5. At first sight, this move creates a weakness on b6. However, white cannot exploit this weakness. It isn't easy to attack this pawn. Besides that, if white attacks it, black can easily defend the pawn. While by playing a5, Nimzowitsch has fixed the weakness on a4, and he can attack this pawn, and it will be more difficult for white to defend his weakness on a4 than for black to defend his weakness on b6. So, as the king side is restrained, the queen side is blockaded, there is nothing else white can do than to reinforce his king side in the anticipation of the attack, because Nimzowitsch is going, of course, to start the attack by playing g5 later in the game. So he plays rook g1, defending the g3 pawn, vacating the f1 square for the bishop, because the h3 is also weak, the bishop is already attacking it, so white is going to reroute his bishop to g2, from which it will defend the weak pawn on h3 and also the weak square on f3. Nimzowitsch plays knight h6, reinforcing his control over the g4 square and also opening the light-squared bishop's diagonal. Bishop f1 followed, bishop d7, targeting the a4 pawn. Now the rook cannot move, it must keep an eye on the a4 pawn. Bishop c1 followed, vacating the d2 square for the knight. So after playing bishop g2, white wants to reroute his knight to the king side, to the defense of the king side, and also as the bishop moved away from d2, the rook might join the defense of the second rank. And now again, before starting his attack on the king side, Nimzowitsch must finish the blockading phase. The queen side is blockaded, but the center isn't blockaded yet. So it would be dangerous, it would be risky to start the attack on the king side while the center isn't blockaded yet, because white can get some counterplay in the center. So it's necessary to force white to play d5, after which the center will be blockaded. But how to do it? Nimzowitsch finds a very deep way to do it. He plays rook c8. Creating a threat of bishop e6, attacking the c4 pawn for the first time, which is currently defended only once, and creating a threat of c takes d after this, after which the c file would open and the rook will attack the c4 pawn for the second time. So, in the anticipation of this threat, as there is after this the c4 pawn would fall, white, without even waiting for black to play bishop e6, plays d5. And now the center is blockaded, the queen side is blockaded. On the king side, white is restrained, he cannot play g4. That means it's only black who can play actively on the king side by playing g5. And as white cannot do anything anyways, Nimzowitsch isn't in a hurry. Before playing g5, he will place all his pieces at the best possible squares. So he prepares the attack, the final phase, the destruction phase. King h8, vacating the g8 square for his rook. White plays knight d2, the knight is heading to f1, of course, to the defense of the king side. Rook g8, bishop g2, vacating the f1 square for the knight, and now g5. Of course, if white captures on g5, that would be in black's favor, because black would simply capture with the rook, the g file would open, the second rook would join the attack, so that it doesn't make any sense for white to capture on g5, and he continues to reinforce his king side, knight f1. Rook g7, vacating the g8 square for the second rook. Rook a2, the rook joins the defense of the king side. Knight f5, so Nimzowitsch activates his knight. The knight is much more active on f5 than on h6. Bishop h1, Rook g8, now that both rooks are on the g file, queen d1, and now that both rooks are on the g file, it's time to open the g file. G takes f. Of course, white cannot capture with the g pawn. In this case, his rook on g1 would fall, so he must capture with the e pawn. And now Nimzowitsch shows a very deep strategic understanding. Of course, white's main weakness is on the king side. So all black pieces are on the king side, so black's main play is gonna be on the king side. But white also has another weakness on c4, and there is no need for black to hurry with the attack on the king side. So before continuing his attack on the king side, Nimzowitsch attacks the second weakness in order to force the white queen to move to the queen side, after which the queen cannot take part in the defense of the king side. So Nimzowitsch plays bishop c8. He's going to play bishop a6, attacking the c4 pawn, and if this pawn falls, of course, white's position would collapse, after which the bishop can capture the knight, which is defending the g3 pawn, after which the g3 pawn would fall. So white must defend this pawn. In the anticipation of bishop a6, white plays queen b3 to defend the pawn. And now the queen cannot take part in the defense of the king side. Nimzowitsch still plays bishop a6. Of course, if white captures the pawn, the c4 pawn would fall, which would be deadly for white, so he cannot capture the pawn. And in case white plays bishop d2, in order to reroute the bishop to e1 so that it defends the g3 pawn, Nimzowitsch gives a very beautiful variation in his annotations. Rook g8, bishop e1, and knight g4 check. And after h takes g, check, king g2, a beautiful bishop sacrifice would follow. Bishop takes c4. At first sight, it isn't clear why he sacrifices the bishop, but you will see why. To lure the white queen to c4 first, and then play a beautiful e3, taking under control the f2 square. f3 is also under black's control. That means black is threatening queen h3 checkmate. And the only way to prevent it is to capture on e3. And now you can see why he lured the queen on c4. Knight takes e3 would be a fork, and white is losing the queen. So that's why after a bishop a6, white played rook e2, which makes sense, attacking the e4 pawn for the second time, which is defended only once. But Nimzowitsch makes another strong move, knight h4, defending his pawn and creating a very unpleasant threat of invasion on f3 with a check, after which white will be forced to give up his light-squared bishop, the main defender of the light squares. And after e takes f, the pawn will invade f3 with a tempo that will be simply deadly. In case, and of course white cannot capture the knight as his rook on g1 would fall. In case white plays knight d2 to take under control the f3 square, Nimzowitsch would have played bishop c8. The bishop has finished its mission on a6, the queen is out of play, it cannot take part in the defense of the king side, so the bishop would return to c8 to the attack of the king side. And in case white queen returns to d1, that wouldn't help. The bishop would still sacrifice itself on h3, eliminating the h3 pawn, and after king takes h3, queen f5 check, if king takes h4, then of course checkmate in 1. If the king retreats to h2, then knight g4 check, king h3, knight f2 double check, king h2, and queen h3 checkmate. And in case instead of queen d1, white plays knight takes e4, then still queen f5 would follow, attacking h3. So white must defend it by playing knight f2, but the beautiful checkmate would follow with the queen sacrifice. And after knight takes h3, knight g4 would be checkmate. That's why after knight h4, white plays rook e3, taking under control the f3 square. So, as the bishop has finished its mission, the queen is out of play, now it returns to c8, taking part in the attack. Now all black pieces take part in the attack of the king side. So he wants to eliminate the h3 pawn, because His main idea to completely destroy white's king side is to move away the knight from h4 and play and move his h-pawn to h4. But in this case, white can always move his g-pawn to g4, as the pawn would be supported by the h3 pawn. That's why, before playing h4, black must eliminate the h3 pawn. That was the idea behind bishop c8. So white plays queen c2, as the queen isn't forced to defend the c4 anymore, queen c2, and the sacrifice on h3 to eliminate this important pawn. It turns out that if the king captures on h3, queen f5 check would follow with the same checkmate which I just showed a couple of moves ago. That's why after bishop takes h3, white captures on e4, attacking the queen. And as the bishop has completed its mission, the h3 pawn is eliminated. Now it retreats to f5. White captures on f5 and knight takes f5. The knight has moved away from h4. And now black is threatening to play h4, after which white's position would collapse. White cannot play g4 anymore, as the h3 pawn is eliminated and it doesn't support the g pawn. And there is nothing white can do about it. Rook e2 followed, as the rook on e3 was attacked by the knight, and of course h4. Rook g2, vacating the g1 square for the king so that it can escape, but it doesn't help. H takes g check, king g1, queen h3, knight e3, vacating the f1 square for the king, and knight h4. So there is no way white can save his rook, but it's not only about a rook. The black's attack is devastating. King f1, and a very strong move. Instead of capturing the rook is doomed anyways, it's pinned. Nimzowitsch plays rook e8, taking under control the e-file and creating an immediate threat of knight takes g2, not only winning the exchange, but after rook takes g2, queen h1 check, the king will be forced to move to e2, to the e-file, and after that the knight will be pinned. Now you see the idea behind rook e8, and that means the rook on g2 will be unguarded, the knight wouldn't defend it anymore as it would be pinned, and the queen would capture the rook. So in case white continues the escape of the king by playing king e1, simply knight f3 check would follow, which after king d1 leads to checkmate. After queen h1 check, the king doesn't have any squares. These squares are controlled by the knight, and that leads to checkmate. That's why after rook e8, white resigned. And now I recommend watching another famous game in which Nimzowitsch carried out one of the greatest knight maneuvers in chess history. But first, like this video and subscribe, as it's really helpful for the channel growth.